James, thanks so much for taking the time to chat. Do you want to quickly introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm James MacLachlan. I'm known as James Mac to many. I'm the visual effects supervisor on TED LASSO.
That's great, man. And I was curious, just for you, starting out in your career, did you always imagine yourself in being in some kind of creative career growing up, or was it something that you just kind of fell into?
I think I was always going to be in the creative arts. All of the subjects I really loved at school, even when I was really young, I can still remember picking up paintbrushes and drawing and staring out the window. I think there's, much to my mother's disdain, there's school reports that endlessly say James stares out the window and imagines things that, he should really be focusing on here in the classroom. So I've always had a brain that sort of floats in and out of stories and dreams and things like that. So I think it was a natural progression that I would end up somewhere in the arts. But there was no real driving plan to end up in visual effects. I sort of followed my nose through art through high school and graphic design, and then ended up looking at architecture, but didn't quite grab me, and ended up in a course in my hometown doing what they called visual communications, but it was effectively computer arts leading to graphic design. So then I went through graphic design into motion graphic design, and then from there I really wanted to start doing movie title sequences. Guys like the 7 title sequence when it came out.
I was waiting for you to bring up Ken.
Yeah, I always wanted to get involved in film title sequences. I did my thesis on topography and motion design, and then ended up working in graphics for a few years, and then segued into visual effects. So through After Effects and all that, and through Flame and into supervising. Yeah.
You were mentioning imaginary forces, so I'd imagine you know Karen Fong over there. Yeah,
I've not met any of these people, but I did write letters to loads of them when I was doing my thesis, and a load of them got back to me, which was really lovely.
What did you say to Karen? Because I'll have to grill her on that and be like, hey, do you remember a specific letter that...
I can't. It was almost pre-internet those days. It was a long time ago. It was more about the philosophy and the process and, servicing the narrative and things like that. And I was at a little design school in Wanganui in New Zealand, and we were a long way from anything over there, but we were very lucky in that we were connected with an American head of the school, Hazel Gammett, who had a load of really great connections. So our tutors were often coming over from America, and the one who led my thesis, Bridget, she worked on the Fight Club font and by proxy title sequence. So through her, I gained more of an interest in what was happening in that field, and sort of focused on that for a year or two. And yeah.
It's curious too with title design, like there's a director who I'm completely spacing, Naomi, but I can't remember her last name. I used to work with her actually at Cutting Edge back in the day, and she was explaining to me title design, because at the time all I wanted to do was blow things up, but it was the first time I think hearing her talk about title design, and again 7 was kind of the catalyst for her. It was just very interesting to kind of see things from a different perspective, and then obviously the more you work with people and work on projects, you get to see a lot of really amazing different designs that come out, and Scarlet Letter and Prologue and all the IF, like all the big leaders doing this stuff. Like for you, I guess, like what was the appeal initially? Like what really grabbed you about title design that made you want to go down that route?
It was really interesting because obviously there's a few sort of different techniques that they sometimes use to use the title sequences at the beginning of a film. They can set the scene, they can give hints and Easter eggs as to what might happen, but they can also set up, sections, like a backstory sometimes, if you want to give them just that little bit extra lead in to understand what's going on. But the way that they service the narrative, and we're able to do it in a sort of slightly more artistic way rather than just banging up title cards. Obviously, I loved all the stuff from Saul Bass all the way back to Saul, then coming through some of the really nice early Bond title sequences. I think it was Morris Binder, and then Kyle Cooper at Imaginary Forces. So there's been these brackets in time where a load of sort of artistic interpretation has been put into them that didn't necessarily have the same flavor as the film, or it wasn't shot in a way that was meant to be part of the film, but the way that they were able to weave the narrative and the content into it and then segue into the film was really lovely. I just liked them as a as a medium. I've always been into topography and drawing letters and stuff. When I was growing up in New Zealand, we had this book that was in every primary school called the lettering book. And it was this sort of ring-bound blue little book that you could draw over the top of the type because there was no computers. So if you wanted a heading on a page of a study you were doing, you'd get out the lettering book and you'd put it underneath your page and you'd draw over the letters. And then you'd have this beautiful title. The words in the actual thing I was writing were probably nowhere near as high up the importance for me as the heading at the top. So that, I don't know, it's just the flourishes of it, I think, was really lovely thing to see.
I was curious too, for you transitioned into VFX supervising pretty early on. What was that experience like in terms of just finding those opportunities and knowing when to pull the trigger on the right things to be able to fast track your career?
I think I was quite fortunate. There's quite a mentality in New Zealand that if you don't know how to do something, you figure out how to do it and you learn it as quickly as you can. And that's part of our ethos, part of our way of growing up. We've also got number 8 wire mentality, where if you can't fix it, you find a way of fixing it, and you get involved. And because of that, it was a relatively small industry when I was there. There was Lord of the Rings, there was Weta, but if you weren't in that system, it was a very different, it felt like another world. It's amazing and it's breathtaking to see what they were achieving, but I wasn't part of that world. So I needed to work out what I wanted to do, and that was essentially early in my career, it was film title sequences. So I knew I had to get involved in being in advertising as a nice little segue, because in New Zealand there was a fairly thriving advertising industry of visual effects houses, post houses, editing houses. So I got into a small place there. At the time it was called Source, and there was a couple of young owners there who ran the place, and they had a lot of faith in a lot of their employees, and we were given a lot to play with. I was working on a Flame the first year of my career, running projects, running jobs, but it was because it was a small market. But fortunately, it was an ambitious market. So we were doing things that, we were having to do head replacements and blue screens and all the bells and whistles at the time in this little place. So if you wanted to know how to do it, you had to learn quick. And I think that philosophy has sort of followed me the whole way through. I've always been naturally quite curious. So I'm always asking people around me about, how they've done something, what they're up to, why they're doing it. And I think that has helped me along the way. It's probably annoyed a few people, but I think that has helped fast track a few of the steps I've made. I've gone into small markets, got myself up and running in New Zealand, then moved to Brisbane in Australia, worked there at a sort of relatively larger post house called the Post Lounge, formerly Beeps, and it was the same there. There was a step up, there was an extension of skill set required, so we'd go and learn things. And I can remember at one moment, the boss there, Steve Cooper, he decided to quote on a TV series, and we hadn't done one in a long time, and a box on a Friday night arrived on my desk, and it was 26 scripts, half-hour long kids show. And he said, we want to quote on this, so we need to know what we need to do. So over the weekend, I read all the scripts and started scribbling down what we needed to do. And by the Monday, we had a rough idea and we started working out numbers. So that was a segue into TV at that point. I was still full-time in advertising, but we took on that TV show and it did reasonably well. And then a couple of years there, and then decided really wanted to be in the center of it and moved to London. So you can see from small town New Zealand to Wellington, to Brisbane, to London, each time it's like slightly bigger market, slightly bigger team, slightly more ambitious scale of, what's going on. I'm quite fortunate that I've been able to take those steps, and I think that's helped. Rather than, being somebody who decided fresh out of university to jump straight into London, which can be quite daunting, I've managed to have these steps along the way. And along the way, there's just been a plethora of people who've helped me, basically, who've given me a lead that has enabled me to keep learning and keep moving forward.
No, that's great. Anytime someone asks me, like, what's the best thing that they can do to really build their career. It's always your network, and of course they don't want to hear that. They want to hear, no, I just got to go learn this software, but again, it's everyone helping everyone. It's so important because I don't know a single person who ever just magically got their career kicked off in a big way without someone else being the gatekeeper for that. So
we're teams and teams and teams of people. Now it might be a team of 2, might be a team of 400. Without the teams, visual effects goes nowhere. I mean, it can, but it will take you decades to do a single commercial with the sheer amount of workforce required to do what is fairly standard effects in a show now or in an ad, or that you can't do it on your own. And it's a big part of when people are looking to employ others as well, is how well will they fit in a group of people, and are they, it's horrible to say it, but are they team players? Are they people who gatekeep? And I've always navigated much more towards the team players everywhere I've been, and found that I just enjoy being around those people more. And I think that's probably helped me.
I was curious too, for you initially having that fun weekend of doing script breakdowns for beeps. How's your process changed these days, where obviously, a couple of decades in, I'm sure it's quite revised, but like, how's that process changed for you now, being able to look at a script and break it all down and the things you look for versus back then where it might have been like, okay, like where's the obvious stuff?
Just with experience, you start to really learn what. I just put question marks next to a script. I do read them all. And I go through and I put question marks as to something that might be a visual effects based on experience. I can read a script and it says it's nighttime in London and, it's a nice shiny building. And you're like, well, okay, that reflects everything. So I know, because reflections are expensive, you've got a truck in the background or you've got to remove some. And it's just, experience of learning what is straightforward visual effects. Okay, well, we're not going to be able to shoot a Premier League player playing on a Premier League football pitch, so we know that's a visual effects shot. Whereas some of the other stuff, there's nice little question marks and nice little problems to be solved. Like you can look at something like a wardrobe stunt or a small thing like a transitional shot where the director wants it to be a oneer, and you read the script and you're like, okay, well, there's 3 pages there in that oneer, so we know we're going to have to stitch a few things together. Let's talk about how and where. And I just start breaking it down that way, and I honestly Google Docs or your preferred online document service, whoever that might be, is where I begin. And I just start jotting and read through it, and then consult people who are in the know. 95% of my job is communication. I've got to be able to sit in rooms with a whole lot of different people from a whole lot of different departments, and together we've got to work out the best way to get the best pixels at the end of what we've finished. Now, that doesn't always mean shoot it, and it doesn't always mean make it a visual effect. It's a balance somewhere in the middle. That's always been the approach, I think, is to talk to as many of the people in the know and question them and get curious, and then have a think about it and prep for it and move forward.
Clear out some windows. And I was talking with Paul Lambert, he's the VFX supervisor in Dune and Dune 2, and he was talking about that Denis Villeneuve, the director, and he just tends to just walk around aimlessly, in your their own head. And I kind of like that because, everyone has a different methodology, and I feel like a lot of the time it's the people who feel like they need to have an answer on the spot rather than I need to go think about that. It's quite artificial because, you need the headspace to go and kind of problem solve, and rather than shooting.
I definitely like going in prepared. I'm not somebody who likes to have curveballs thrown at me constantly, but I do like a balance. So I like to be prepared. I like to go in with a plan. I like to have chatted to everybody and we know, roughly what we're going to do. And then I'm happy with the curveballs as well, because it satisfies my need to problem solve when on set as well. So prime example is the great British weather. You can plan all you want for a lovely sunny football match in Manchester where everything's lit the same, and there's no wind, so you're fine. And then you arrive on the set and it's driving rain sideways and you need to put green screens up, and you change your approach based on what's come at you when your boots on the ground. And I really like that about being a VFX soup. It's a constantly changing atmosphere, but with best laid plans in place, I think is a lovely approach. Great way to work. It's enjoyable.
I was curious too, you've been involved in TED LASSO. How did that project specifically come around?
I have a friend, Jen Godden, who's a VFX producer, who I've worked with at a couple of post houses over the years in advertising. And she has an agent, Harriet Donington, and Harriet gave me a call. And it was the middle of the pandemic, or it was the beginning of the pandemic. And Harriet said, oh, we've got this little 22-minute comedy shot out in West London. They might need a couple of days for you on set. Because at that point, series 1 had been shot, but I don't think it had been released. And I said, oh, okay, great. That sounds, yeah, I'm in. Like, I lived nearby. I could jump on my bicycle if I needed to and ride out to the studio. So all the stars aligned on that front. And I turned up and did a meeting with everybody there, sort of the production heads and everybody. Kip Kroger, Caitlin Hollenbeck, who were in LA at the time, they were sort of heading up post-production and supervising all of that. So that we had a few chats, got along with them really well, and then had a chat to the lead vendor on the football Barnstorm VFX, Corey and Lawson over in LA.
Just had both of them on the podcast actually a few weeks back. So.
Yeah, I spotted that. I've listened to it. I've done my homework.
They're great.
And, I got along with Corey and Lawson and Kip and Caitlin really well. And it just seemed to gel. You know, I knew enough about football. I knew enough about visual effects. I'd done a lot of stadium work in advertising over the years, you know, big commercials for Nike and Idents, you know, brand campaigns. And so I think it just aligned. And so I said, yeah, I'll go out and supervise that one. It was non-consecutive days at that point because it didn't seem like that many visual effects were needed in the show, but it grew over time. We were very fortunate. You know, the guys did a cracking job on series 1 in terms of writing and acting, and, you know, you got a lot of Emmys. It did very well. And so second time round, the scripts were that much more ambitious. Everything, you know, got turned up to 11, as it were. And so I jump on my bicycle, head out there and do my best to fit in on a TV set. I hadn't done a lot of TV set work at that point, but I'd done a lot of large scale ads. So I knew my way around a set, but there were a few sort of lingo things that I needed to pick up on, which I was a bit short on early in the piece. But there was a load of people who were absolutely lovely and prepared to offer me their time and patience and gave me advice. And so I'd duck around the set talking to the scriptee and the first AD, and then I'd drop over to the gaff, and I'd pick up as much as I could whenever there were little gaps in my schedule. And it's entirely because of that I was able to be as comfortable as I was on that set and know, you know, what we were covering, when we were covering it, scheduling it all, getting it, you know, up and running, and then making sure that the post houses, the vendors over in LA were getting everything they needed. So it was a delight. I mean, it was a really great set to be on for 2 seasons. Yeah. Between
the 2 seasons, like, how did the scope change? Was it similar to season 1 where each season's a bit more ambitious, a bit more money? And
I mean, the episodes were significantly longer. The football sequences were significantly longer. By the 3rd season, we were at a fair amount. We did over 1,000 shots. We did 1,200 shots of football visual effects in season 3. We got nowhere near that in season 2. So that's 1,200 shots of football plus all of the other visual effects shots. So I think I covered in excess of 3,000 shots in season 3. So it did grow, but it was all similar methodologies that we built upon that we'd covered in season 2. So, you know, we would adapt and change, and things grew, you know, scope and scale went up. But because we were building on something where many of the crew who were working on season 2 came back for season 3, it wasn't a big leap because we all had a shorthand with how we were, in theory, going to shoot all of these things and put it all together. So we came back together before season 3 and we would go through all the scripts and just make sure that we were doing them in a way that was achieving the best results by the end. But yeah, it grew. Yeah.
And was it episode 11 that got nominated for an Emmy? Can you talk a little bit about that Mom City, as we were talking about before we started?
Yeah, it's weird to say Mom City as a Kiwi. But I'll get used to it eventually. Yeah, it's the scale and scope of it is quite interesting. Jason and Brendan and Bill wrote this amazing episode, which had the team Richmond playing in Manchester City's Etihad Stadium. So I don't know if you've ever visited a Premier League stadium, but there's two things. The first is if you put a toe on their grass over the white line, a groundsman somewhere who you can never spot them, they're hiding, will yell, extremely colourful language at you. So we knew we weren't going to be able to shoot on the pitch, but as we'd been doing prior, we didn't ever shoot on a Premier League football pitch. We shot at Years.He, which is a semi-professional team out in West London, which was across the road from our studio, which made it super convenient. And they were absolutely brilliant, the club. They had a groundsman there who was lovely, Derek. He's actually the groundsman in the show. He's riding the little ride-on mower. Right. So he would prepare a ground for us. They'd put everything up. We'd run some green screens around. And so we would shoot all of the football footage in Years.He's ground, knowing full well we were going to strip in other grounds. With Manchester City, the only slight difference we realized when we went up there was the ground drops off quite significantly at the sides. So we had a LiDAR company, Visual Skies, come in and LiDAR the whole of Manchester City's ground. So we knew the differences between what we were shooting at Years.He and what we were looking to achieve later. Visual Skies did a great job. They shot LiDAR and photogrammetry, so we were able to map in sections of the stadium, but we knew we were going to build it in CGI. They were just giving us the extra flourishes on top to make sure all of it was super accurate, because if you get one little bit wrong, there'll be a football fan somewhere who will have a say. To his credit, Brendan Hunt, who's Coach Beard in the show, he's got a football brain like you wouldn't believe. He's ridiculously experienced and knowledgeable on football. And so he was great because he was always on set when we were shooting the football, helping out Pedro, the second unit director, who covered all of the football. Pedro did a great job. So there was a whole lot of football brains involved in it. And we would shoot at Years.He, and then I would create these maps with the script supervisor. And what we would do is we would map out where on the pitch we were in Years.He. We would map out where in theory we were in Manchester City. And then we would work out some camera blocking, we'd work out some things. But typically speaking, our camera setups would all be based on real world ones. So pitch line cameras and a gantry camera and a goal camera. And we would work with a broadcast setup effectively. We were shooting on ARRI cameras. We weren't shooting on broadcast cameras. We shot on ARRI Alexa. And so we would have this plan of where we were in the stadium. We knew what we were doing. And then after we'd shot the football, we would then go up to Manchester. We went up to City and we sat in the stands at the dugouts and the corporate boxes and any, changing rooms and things like that. And we shot all the additional material that was, more narrative based rather than football based in those scenes, with a few hundred extras in the crowd. And then it was a case of putting it all together. Yeah, which is, handing it over to the amazing team at London VFX. So we knew we were putting stadiums around, we were putting dugouts in, we were having to cover all of the crowd, all of the, extra bits and bobs that you get, like photographers and linesmen and stewards and all that. And it was a case of stitching it all together. So in terms of what we were achieving, we shot in anywhere up to 5 different locations that were put into one, because we had crowd shoots, we had haze and yelling shoots, we had dugout shoots, and we had to ensure that it all felt seamless. You know, all the eye lines were right, all of the action was happening in the right places. And so, yeah, it was a fairly mammoth task, but it's really interesting the way the football plays out. Because I don't know if you can remember did you watch any sports when it was the middle of the pandemic, when they didn't have crowds?
No, but I love some of the internet going crazy because they see photos of New Zealand actually with people playing football and everyone's yelling like, why aren't you separating? It's just like, because we took it seriously in the beginning.
Yeah. When they tried playing the Premier League here without any crowds in it. So there was no crowds because of the pandemic. Yeah. So what happened was you had this weird game of football where you could hear all the players yelling at each other, which was great. But sat at home, it didn't feel like a football game. And I think that's a really lovely analogy for what the guys at Barnstorm were able to achieve, because what the players and actors were doing on the pitch was the narrative, and it was all beautifully written. But until it had the crowds in, the atmosphere of a Premier League football match wasn't necessarily there. So it was really important. It was super important for everybody to bring that atmosphere to these sequences in Mom City. So we had real performers really being filmed, really being captured in a volume stage, and then put into this stadium digitally. Real people, real performances, because we knew that was what would be required. It's not it sounds relatively simple to fill a stadium up with fans, but what would happen in Ted Lasso is there's these really lovely beats and arcs in the script where, Manchester are getting ahead and Richmond are failing. So you've got to balance the crowds out. You've got to match the emotions of how a crowd feels and reacts to a moment on a field, and really enhance the sequences, enhance the scenes using that. And the edit would change. And so we knew we had to have a relative amount of flexibility moving forward to change the crowds. So it wasn't a simple case of just, okay, well, we'll tile the stadium because there's 53,000 seats or something up there. So we knew we had to have a nice little technique to fill the stage, to fill the seats in a way that was flexible, because you want them to be anxious, you want them to be excited, you want them to be calm and maybe relaxed while the play's in the middle of the pitch. So we went to great lengths to make sure that we were using real people, real performances, and trying to build on that emotion. And we did that using a few techniques, but the primary one was we volume captured on Metastage a group of people one by one that were enabled us to have all of the emotions. So we had this video that we would play to people before they went onto the stage. And the play, it was like a choreographed dance. So they would have this, now we need you to go crazy. Oh, your team's losing. Oh, down you go. And it's no biting. And it's exciting. And no. And so you'd end up with all of these really emotive beats, and they all aligned. So we were able to then put all of these captures together, knowing that they were doing the same emotions at the same time, which meant that when we put the sequences together, if you needed excited, we knew where in that capture it was, and we would align that. And then the guys at Barnstorm aligned it, put it into the shots, and helped add all of that emotion to all of those scenes. It was really nice to see that all of the people in all of the crowds are real people giving real performances. I think it helps.
If I recall, a lot of games were trying to put cardboard cutouts of people in the stadium just to help, I guess, the players.
Yeah.
You're like, okay, like there's an audience. I'd read somewhere that you were instructing Barnstorm about not to mix the different crowds because of the rivalry between them. Is that a thing?
Yeah. So what was hilarious was not so much the seniors at Barnstorm, they all knew, but to get crowds roughly and quickly into the setup so that, it's like you block it in often some of the more junior artists, because in the American games you mix the crowds. Here in Britain, you do not mix the crowds.
The fist fights.
Well, mostly for reasons of violence. So you have these little, what they call away sections at these grounds, at all of the grounds. So we always had to understand where that away section was, build it in, and then fill each of the sets of crowds accordingly. So that often here in the UK, they'll get away crowds will get bussed to a ground, and then they'll get fed in through a very specific tunnel into their section. And then they'll have to stay there while the rest of the crowd leaves at the end of the match, and then they come out. It's a very choreographed dance by the policing system and stuff here. But yeah, it was quite funny because instantly, as a person who's followed the English Premier League for so long, a first render would come out, and I'd be like, no, you can't have Richmond guys sitting next to, Man City women and Man City men next to, kids in Richmond kid. It doesn't quite work like that over here. So yeah, we had to delineate where that was. And actually, that, to be fair to the production, that was one thing we slightly tweaked away from the realism of the actual ground due to the narrative. There's a moment where there's a large scale moment happens. I don't know if I'm allowed to talk about the show. I don't want to give away too many spoilers. But because of where a player runs to celebrate, he had to run to his group of people. He wouldn't run to the away team and celebrate right in front of them. That would incite violence. So we had to slightly move where the away crowd sits in that episode, just to suit the narrative that Jason and Brendan had brought forward.
When you are working on set, what are some of the typical tools that you bring onto set with you?
The first thing I would bring is my phone and my iPad. It's super important to have all of the documentation with you, and nowadays we're not printing out thousands of scripts, and for security reasons we don't. So you have to have the scripts on you with all of your documents and your little markups and everything on you. And my iPad is great for that as well. You take photos, you can use your phone to LiDAR sets, roughly LiDAR, so that you can annotate and send things to people. So I end up with things like Google Docs, which is really useful, all my emails. But then on top of that, it's things like Sunseeker is a lovely one because of the Great British weather. You need to know where the sun's coming up, when it's hiding behind a stand, when it's not, when it's going to poke out. That's a really useful one. Weather apps, obviously. Polycam is a great one for capturing sets. But Artemis Pro is a really another lovely one too. I spend most of my days on set sitting on the shoulder of the DOP and the director, because between the three of us, that's when I find out when I'm really needed. So with Artemis Pro, it's really nice because I can go out, I can put in the camera, I can put in the lenses that we've got, and we can get a frame up and take a shot. And all of the DOPs I know use it as well. So we can work out genuine framings for things, because when you're standing in a stadium and looking straight ahead, how many people are we going to see? On a 12mm lens, you're going to see 25,000, but on an 85, you're going to see much less. So it helps me understand from a production level what's required to, blend the area between what is in camera and what is real and what is visual effects. Because often production were really good on Ted Lasso. They gave us a load of extras up there. We had about 200. But in a 53,000 seat stadium, they get swallowed up so quickly.
They're to scale reference.
Yeah, exactly. Especially when you're shooting with two cameras too. So if you're crossing two cameras. So the AD team, we had crowd teams who were absolutely brilliant. Gabe up there, it was like a dance. Every time the DOP would move the camera or lens, they'd start shuffling people and moving them around, because we'd always want to blur that line between what's real and what's not. And we would never want to restrict the DOP at all, because if the lens feels off, if it doesn't feel comfortable and right for the scene, then it's always going to feel off. Whereas if you get it right, take your time, we'll shuffle in people, get them into that mid ground, and then we know we're going to replace from, 3, 4, 5 layers of people back. We'll fill in those seats. That was always our approach, was to try and blend that line with real people wherever we could. The only time it got a little bit fruity for us was when we were moving around very quickly with the camera and setting new setups, and we'd have a handful of people, and it would be a slightly odd angle relative to the seats. So it might be correct for, let's say you've got the coaches talking on the front in the dugouts. It's an odd camera angle because you don't see that in games facing the coaches. So it was sort of, we needed to make sure that we were able to place people in all of the seats. And that's where Metastage was really useful, because we were volume captured. They were a 3D object. They were a real person moving, doing real movements. They weren't animated. They were volume captured every frame.
Yep.
And that enabled us to place them in 3D and relight them in 3D. Well, in Nuke and in 3D. Those systems enabled us to really help the DOP and the directors and Jason service the narrative in a way that really, really helped it and added to it. And those captures of the Metastage people, and to a degree the sprites we captured, but predominantly the Metastage, they held up really close. So we were able to put them pretty close to the actors in some points, but with that little blurred line in between where we would have a handful of real people in the lens.
That's really cool. I'm keen to check it out, actually. And I was curious too, just to pivot a little bit, but you working for 2 decades and having experience directing a lot of projects, I'm kind of curious how that experience informs you as a supervisor as well, getting to kind of switch the roles and direct rather than necessarily doing the VFX supervision.
It comes back to that thing in the beginning. I'm naturally inquisitive, so I've always kind of been really interested in what people around me are doing as well. And so over the years, I found myself always hanging out with the DOPs and the directors on set, so I would always be listening. But I think a VFX soup is a very interesting role in terms of how many people you have to connect with on a set. I'm not sure how often the gaffer has to talk to the script supervisor. I'm not sure how often the makeup designer has to talk to the props department. But for me as a VFX supervisor, I have to talk to all departments at some point, because a light might need moving. Somebody might need a little touch up on makeup for the day because they've got a zit that one day and they don't have one another day, or a blemish or whatever. And then there might be art department might have factored in, 95% of the stadium, but there's this tiny little sign miles off in the distance, which we see in 3 shots. So I'm talking to all of these departments, and that, I think, is the only other person who comes close to that is the director. And so they're used to that sort of level of communication. And it always interested me directing because of the communication, less so than the role itself. It's a great role to have. It's a lot of fun to be directing a project, but I think because I directed, I'm used to seeing maybe some of the problems that need solutions that directors come across. I think I can anticipate a few of those because of how I've worked as a director, knowing about scale and where compromises have to be made at their end, but where we as visual effects supervisors can be solutions down the line to small problems at their end that can snowball. But actually, if we do little tweaks here and there with talking with the director and talking with the DOP, it enables, a little chat to the art department about putting something up that completely changes the scope of the scene can help the director. And I think that's what probably I took from directing when I was directing, was how many people you have to chat to and how you service as a whole. It really, all that matters is what's happening as a whole. Like, everybody has to do their job to the best of their abilities, but at the end of it, if everybody isn't working towards what that whole finished product is, it can suffer. But I think if you're a director and you recognize that you're chatting to all the departments and your VFX super's on side and just has got your back towards the end and also pre-prod, I think it really helps everyone. It's a nice little sort of thread through the middle that helps problem solve effectively.
I love that. And I'll make sure to link to your website as well, but I know that you do a lot of photography that's posted on there too. I was kind of curious, what's the importance of understanding color, light, composition, things like that for visual effects? In other words, getting behind the camera and getting familiar with how composition works?
In terms of a visual effects supervisor, I mean, I used to love doing art when I was a kid growing up. But I think out of all of the disciplines that help a VFX suit, the camera is your number one thing to learn in terms of composition. You can anticipate, I don't know if everybody's like this, but I see scripts in my head. I literally see them playing out as frames. Most people probably feel that way too. It's a bit like reading a book, you get all the pictures in your head. And if you've got the pictures in your head, then translating them into a camera in a way that people are familiar with and used to. So as a viewer, it's like jumping over the line. You don't do it because it doesn't make sense to the viewer's head. So to me, photography has always been a way of telling little stories with the camera in a way that the viewer appreciates what's going on and really likes the look of what they're seeing, but also the narrative behind, why you're using a long lens, why you're on a wide, why you're on a Ronin running through a field, why you're on a locked off big wide gantry cam. It's to service the narrative, and photography is a narrative as well. I've always been into photography. My dad used to bring out the camera, and this is in the 80s in New Zealand. And whenever Dad brought out the camera and got in the car, we knew we were going somewhere interesting. Mm-hmm. So I think there's probably like a little bit of a sociological sort of something to dig into there. But, the camera always meant something special was happening. And we'd end up
Pavlov's dogs, but with an SLR.
Yeah, there you go. So I've always been into photography. So I've shot with neg, I've shot with digital, I've shot with high 8, I've shot with all sorts over the years. And it's always been about understanding light and how that can work. I think in visual effects terms, when we all started switching to ACEs and using linear color workflows and everything, it made more sense to my brain. Having worked in Rec 709 in the past, I was like, oh man, I know there's detail in those clouds, but we don't get it because we're shooting on, whatever we're shooting on.
Yeah.
Photography's always been huge. I've actually got, I don't know if your viewers won't be able to see this, but I've got some 120mm neg here that I've shot. I made a camera a few years ago out of Lego. I need to put it up on my website, but I shoot, medium format film on a Lego camera that I made, and I shoot 35mm and I shoot digital, and I'm looking into cyanotype at the moment. Light has always been my driving fantasy of storytelling, like dark and shadow. I was never into HDRI when people started giving away all the details in the shadow. I love it when I can't see what's going on in the shadows or it's too bright, and just chatting to DOPs. I love DOPs are just an endless wealth of knowledge on this front. And David Rom and Vanessa White, who shot Mum City, they were just amazing to be around. I mean, just sitting on their shoulders all day, listening to them, working out what they were doing was just amazing to see the storytelling.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Anytime I got to get used to saying DOP against a DP, but it's better than a few times I've heard people in Australia say DOP, which I feel like is more condescending almost, But, out of every single discipline, I feel like the DP or DOP has to really have envisioned every single frame, and they usually have. And so a lot of time the director can think of the bigger picture, but it's the DP and the AD that are, a lot of times getting their hands dirty. But I've just always been fascinated by that because, again, it's looking at a script of a bunch of words and being able to then envision every single detail and how it all comes together, and then consistency with every other frame that gets shot as well. So it's always been intriguing whenever you do get to sit down and pick someone's brain who's just wired to do that all day long.
Ness won't know this, Vanessa White, but I used to sneak off when she was setting up for the scenes. She'd wander into the sets and she'd grab her gaffer and they'd sit down, and she would grab the camera crew as well, and she'd start chatting about what they were looking to achieve in the scene, pointing in certain directions. And then she had these beautiful little hand-drawn diagrams that she'd do really quickly on the spot. So she'd draw the set and she'd be like, I'm going to put camera 1 here, camera 2 here, we're going to go this way, that way. And it was, I would just sit in the background, just behind them, just out of shot, as it were, and just listen to how they worked as a team. And it was amazing synchronization between all of them. The way that they were able to offer up little things to her, and then she would machinate on that, and then, you know, come back with, you know, how approaches and directions and ideas and everything. And there was loads to learn just listening in, which is another quite a good, the role of the VFX supervisor is quite a good role for that. You're not really, you can wander around the set and listen in on things that are happening that, you know, a lot of other people don't actually have a lot of access to. You know, hearing the director at the monitors chatting with the DOP it's awesome. It's so much fun. And you know, then they might wander on set and you're putting up some track markers or something, but you might be listening into you know, the discussions with the actor about the information of, you know, what they achieved in the last scene with how they did something with their, you know, the lift of an eyebrow or whatever. And I think we're given fairly free rein because nobody really knows what we're doing. So that's quite a fun aspect to being on these sets. Yeah.
Given all of your experience working on set and working on all these different areas, like for you, have there been any big lessons that you've taken with you from early in your career or along the way? Again, like working and being around so much amazing talent, just things you picked up that have stuck with you?
I mean, hundreds of thousands of little things, I think, is the way to look at it for me. That's the way my brain works. You know, all the conversations I have with people constantly on set, asking them little questions. It's not one big, for me, it's not one big lesson. It's been a series of bite-sized, constant little pieces of learning. Both of my parents were teachers, so I was taught fairly young that you can finish school, but school doesn't finish. Like you keep learning to stay interested in things. And for me, it was always, if I ever had a free moment, I'd wander over to somebody, focus puller. I'd be like, hey, how do you do that? What's that? Well, oh, okay, great. And you pick up all of these little things, and they create this like world for you, this bubble of information that is really interesting. And then they start to all connect if you listen to enough people. My career, my life would not be what it is without the hundreds of people thousands of people who've given me little pieces of information that just make it really interesting and really a lovely thing to do for a job and for a lifestyle. Without that, I think I was never one to sit down and always just read books. For me, it's about, I definitely, you know, it's not to say I don't read books, but most of my information comes from people, experiences, and definitely people from different areas of the world and life and aspects. And I was taught very young when I did my graphic design career. I was very fortunate. My lecturer said to me, she said, whatever you do moving forward, if you're staying in graphic design, she was talking about graphic design, she said, stay in touch with people in fashion, stay in touch with people in art, stay in touch with people in design, stay in touch with people in film and TV, stay in touch with people in restaurant business. Because she said it's all about service industry and the arts, and we all think in a way that we're servicing people, and we're doing it in ways that our brains connect dots that not necessarily other people see those connections. And I think, yeah, just weaving all of those people together has been the way I've managed to do it.
That's great. I think growing up, working at places like Cutting Edge or Beeps, or especially the UK has got this down pat too. I think that taught me a lot about client service. And that's something that I feel like in visual effects a lot of the time, especially in the States, you just kind of jump in and get your hands dirty and do stuff. But getting to see the importance of, you know, someone's paying $1,000 an hour to sit in a Flame suite and get something comped. Part of that experience is getting to talk about the cricket and whatever else. And, you know, you're really catering to them as much as you are catering to their work. And that's something that I think is so valuable, is realizing that no matter where you are in what you're doing, you are in a client service industry. And a lot of people, I think, do forget that. So having the backgrounds that we've had, I think you get to see how that plays out, and, you know, how part of that whole experience for them is the reason they come back is because that little banter and, you know, the way that they felt privileged for a minute to go in there and all hands on deck catering to them rather than just, yeah, we'll get those shots out to you, you know, by the end of the week or whatever?
All of my best clients have become friends, and other flame artists have other clients and friends. It's not a dichotomy. You don't, once your clients become your friends, they naturally come back and you enjoy their time, and you find all of the things that you have in common outside of the project you're working on, and you chat about those. As you say, you bang on. We've got to take the time to understand that whilst there is technology in what we're doing as VFX supervisors, actually we're servicing a whole bunch of people in a lovely script, and they've poured their heart and soul into that, and it's our job to get the best out of it, but to make sure that they feel comfortable with what we're doing. Often it's quite important for us as VFX supervisors to explain why we're doing something, just so that they feel at ease with what's happening on a set if they're not familiar with it, because there's a lot of directors out there who haven't necessarily done a lot of work with visual effects or with visual effects supervisors. So you have to strike up a key relationship, and often that is that first protocol, that first impression. You wander up and you say, "Hi, I'm James, I'm the VFX super," and then you'll try and find something in common with them outside of the project, and then it's a nice, easy relationship to settle into, rather than, "Hi, I'm James and I'm here to service your 47 shots." It's all just a bit boring doing that, right?
That's right. That's beautiful. James, it's been awesome to catch up and just to discuss everything, because I'm definitely keen to check out that episode, as well as, just so I can connect the dots with everything that you've been going through. But it's been super awesome getting to catch up.
Thanks, mate. I really appreciate it. It's been a lot of fun. Cheers.